Okay, we're going to be discussing using active voice. So we're here in Unit 12, and active voice is something that I think a lot of students struggle with, and so it is important to unit here. So generally, a writer should use active voice instead of passive voice. The writer should also avoid shifting from active to passive voice or vice versa. There are reasons and there are some types of writing which oftentimes require passive voice. And I think if you read a lot of historical informational, especially I would say older historical documents, they are often written in the passive voice. So that's why I think students sometimes struggle with it, because a lot of the readings that you have done are written by that in that way. But we want to start using active voice as much as possible. So what does it mean? What's the difference between the two? At the top here, it points it out, active voice is when your subject is doing something. Your subject is doing the action. Passive voice is when something is being done to the subject. Okay, so something is being done, they're not moving, something is coming to them versus they do something. So what does that look like in real writing? Well, passive voice oftentimes will have this by at the end, who does it. And one of the reasons we like to use active voice is to avoid awkward construction. Passive voice leads to confusion and miscommunication, which is why we don't like it specifically in writing. It feels like you're hiding who's doing something, even if you don't mean to, and then it's confusing for your reader to follow along with you. So passive voice is oftentimes awkward, right? Like we could hear the sentence, the new hit was sung by Beyonce. Okay, great. But it would be much more direct if we just say Beyonce sang the new hit. And as we discussed last class, notice how the verb goes from being a weak verb to a strong verb. So in this passive voice one here, the new hit is the subject. And unfortunately, the new hit isn't doing anything. It's just sitting there. There's no verb before it. In the active voice, Beyonce is the subject. She is the one who's doing something, right? She's singing. So here we have another example that's kind of awkward. Joseph's diary is read by Annabeth, where we want to say Annabeth reads Joseph's diary. And the best strategy to avoid unnecessary use of passive voice is for students to consciously use action verbs and not forms of the verb to be whenever possible. And I know you have heard this hundreds of times by now, because we talk about this a lot, to avoid those to be verbs and use active verbs. Passive voice and active voice can also be confusing to your reader if you incorrectly shift midway through in a paragraph or in a section. So incorrect, Joe fractured his toe, therefore the race was lost by him. Switches from active to passive voice. See how this first part, Joe fractured his toe, we have our strong verb here, but here we have the race was lost by him. Right? He lost the race is what we should have, which is down here. I also just want to take a note and point out the punctuation here, because some of you are still struggling with this, where we have Joe fractured his toe, semicolon, therefore, comma, the race was lost by him. When you have two sentences combined, this is a compound sentence, right? We're using our semicolon, but we have a transition word, comma. Oftentimes students just like to use two commas there, one before and one after, but that is not an interrupter here. It's a transition word. So that's why the difference. You can interrupt with however, but sometimes when you use however, you need the semicolon. But of course, I never encourage you to use the word however, because that's one of our dirty dozen words. All right, incorrect. Screams of joy could be heard passive as the rescue boat approached. Active, right? We can switch it even within the sentence. So instead, we want to say the survivors screamed joyfully as the rescue boat approached. Strong, strong. So like I said, sometimes you will use passive voice. It's not like a wrong thing that you will never, ever do. You just want to be conscious of when you're using it and how. And I think that's true of most writing. There's not necessarily right or wrong, but you want to look at the context, your audience, your purpose, and why you're doing things. So you may use the passive voice when you need to emphasize the action rather than the actor. And I want to point out, when you see passive voice, I think the most common place we see it is in the news. Any sort of news article typically is passive voice. A car was robbed on Broadway and blah, blah, blah. they don't know who robbed it. So the focus is on the car was robbed. We don't know who. When politicians apologize, they say things like, mistakes were made. They don't say, I made a mistake, right? So you hear it a lot kind of in public discourse, and there's reasons why the subject is left out. So you could say, like, I was baptized in the Mississippi River. The active voice, my minister baptized me in the Mississippi River, emphasizes the minister. That doesn't really make sense, because the baptism would be like you're kind of the focus of this. It's your story. And so you would want to be kind of the focus of that sentence. And this is the thing about writing in general that I feel like we've been learning all year long, is you have to consider, what is my purpose? What is my point? And what am I doing here? Another example that would be correct is the boys were injured in an automobile accident, right? An automobile accident injured the boys, suggested the accident was actively trying to injure the boys. Like, that's not what happened. And I would argue that, like, the boys are more important here than the accident, right? We typically care for people more than objects. And so that's why it is correct to use passive voice here. So you are going to be practicing this as usual. You're going to be looking here. So instead of I was invited by Steve to the movies, we would say Steve invited me to the movies. For the second example, instead of saying several difficult challenges are faced by first-year teachers, we would say first-year teachers face several difficult challenges, period. This has 3, so go ahead and go through revising the sentences, practicing your writing, checking the grammar, and we're going to do all 3 today to make our sentence clearer and our communication stronger, which is always the goal.